Amber is a lecturer in competition law at University of Manchester and a senior research fellow at the Centre of Law, Economics and Society at UCL London. And her research is truly groundbreaking and innovative. She looks at the intersection between competition law and human rights, and in particular the right to food. She's also a comparative lawyer and looks at competition law in India and Pakistan, and has a book that was recently published. The title is Competition Law in South Asia, and we can maybe talk about that during the Q&A. Amber, without taking too much time, Amber will talk about her new research on competition law and food and sustainability, something that is very much at the heart of the Sustainable Global Economic Law project. The reason why the research is so innovative, and I had a pleasure to listen to Amber this morning as she was presenting some of her research to our students, is because it really asks the sort of hard questions about structures and the structure and paradigms that underpin competition law, and how these paradigms can potentially be changed to ensure, to foster human rights and sustainability. Amber, you have the floor, and then we will have a Q&A.
Thank you, Ivana, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. And thank you, Kati and Ivana, for inviting me. It is an absolute pleasure. And I know competition law is not everyone's favorite subject, so I appreciate that you made the time regardless. I also understand that you're not all competition lawyers, so the talk, I hope, will not be too competition heavy, despite competition being in the title. I think we can safely agree that we all love food. So I think the focus will be on food really, and how it reaches us. And the question that I pose for you is, who is really paying for what we're eating, and how are they paying? So I think with that question in mind, let's begin. Does this work? If this works, okay. Yeah, okay, so I think I'll move a little bit closer so I can work this easily. Right, so I posed 5 questions to frame this discussion. I want to see what we understand by hunger, what it means in terms of international human rights. Does the market care about human rights? That's another question. How does competition play out in transnational food markets, and what is the impact? Who bears the impact? And can competition enforcement help? I just want to say that I don't have definitive answers on many of these things, so it is a debate. It's an ongoing debate, but sometimes it's important to frame the questions. Not rushing to answers is not always necessary. So in that spirit, okay. Now it's working. So yes, the faces of hunger. So I just wanted to spend a minute with you, a second really with you, to show you 2 faces of hunger. The picture will it be on your left? Yeah, that's the one that we normally associate with hunger. I think all of us growing up or in charity appeals, that's the face of hunger that we see. When I see it, I see a distant land, somewhere I don't really identify with. I see a sort of a racialized version of hunger as well. It's far from me in so many ways that in some ways it's not my problem because it's so far away from me, and it happens in countries which have other issues as well. But the second picture, and we won't say which country it is, but it could be anywhere really in the West, right? We might look at this and think, gosh, these people are eating too much. It's not about they're eating too little, they're eating too much. But I would suggest to you that this is also hunger. And we will talk about why this might be hunger. So this is a picture closer to us. These are people we might see across the field or, across the street from us. I mean, they're sitting in a field, so I'm imagining. But this is something that we're more familiar with, and I think we perhaps need to reframe how we think about hunger. It's not just something happening in a distant, war-torn, racially different space, but also happening in the space that we occupy. And it is not a distant problem, but an immediate problem. So with those two pictures in mind, and why this both are hunger in that very sort of quote unquote hunger in that specialized definition of the word, let's take a look a little bit about how international law looks at hunger. So the first enunciation of the right to food, that people have a right to food, was in Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At this stage, food was not recognized as an independent right that all people have. It was part of the group of rights under the right to health. So health was paramount, and food was, so think of it as nutrition, not just food. And I think that was the focus. This was developed as late as 1976. I mean, I think it's quite a while between 1948 and 1976 for people to start thinking, no, you need food in itself is important. And in separately from health, it should have its own program. And this was the International Convention of Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, which said that they recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing, and housing. Okay, so it's a much more stronger focus. States went off. I mean, states don't have an absolute obligation to realize this right. It's just there's a minimum core obligation. It's programmatic. You should work towards it. You don't need to have it. Everybody should not be supplied with food, but you should work towards universal eradication. And you all know that it's still part of our Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 that we should eradicate hunger. So all these things have not really had the kind of effect that one would hope that they might have. One of the issues with the inability to realize the right of food has also been not really understanding what it means. And I think after 1976, the state parties went back to the UN and said, we don't really know what you mean. What do you mean by the right of food, a right to food? And that resulted in the General Comment number 12, which was published in 1999, which unpacked the right a little bit and really identified 3 prongs, which I will, I think, focus on in the next slide. Yeah. So the 3 prongs are adequacy, accessibility, and availability of food. Adequacy refers to the nutritional appropriateness of food, and also the notion of sustainability or food security, implying food being accessible for both present and future generations. So you're not depleting the soil in a way that there'll be no food for future generations. So that's adequacy. Accessibility, from my perspective, what was really interesting was that we're also talking about economic accessibility to food. So food is not just whether, a lot of us are not, well, all of us possibly are not living off the land, right? We're not buying from our own farm and eating, unless some of you have farms in your backyards, which I don't know about. But we're all purchasing. Even the farmer who has a farm is actually not producing for himself or herself or for the family. They're also selling that and purchasing something else. So I think the economic accessibility has become increasingly relevant over the years. And it also is about the relative price of food, because you don't want food to be such a large part of your consumption basket that you actually can't have anything else. So that was an important factor. And availability relates to the distribution systems through which food reaches us and how effective they are. I will say to you that the second picture that we saw about the overeating, which I would not call it overeating, that's the obesity crisis that is really big in the US. A lot of it is actually about distribution, because the packaged food is easier to distribute in stores. So they eat a lot of junk food just because it's easier and cheaper. I always notice how much cheaper junk food is in the supermarket. And you do wonder about that. You wonder why that is the case. So I think in terms of availability, what kind of food we're making available to the people also makes a big difference. So there was this 3-pronged approach to the right of food. And then we had in 2000, the first ever rapporteur on the human right to food, Olivier de Schutter, who actually made the link Now, looking back, it seems like such an obvious link, but you think, my goodness, somebody had to step up in 2000 and say there is a link between how markets function and how we eat. And I think the important point that he made is not just how we eat as people who consume food, but also bringing to mind the people who are producing food, who are also doubling up as consumers, because they're no longer living off the land, but they're also part of that increasingly globalized supply chain where what they produce goes on to processors and retailers and doesn't come directly to them. So they also have to go through the market loop to get the food. So I think there's some sort of a romanticism that farmers probably grow what they eat. But I think it is, I would say that maybe it is true in certain circumstances, but on the whole, that is just a romantic notion that is not actually embedded in reality. So that brings us then to our next question. So here we are smack bang in the middle of the market now. We're right to food, great aspirations, great programs for humanity, but then really at its core, it is about how the market functions. And at that point, it's interesting to consider what the morals of the market are. And I have to really credit Jessica White, who has written a brilliant book on the morals of the market, brilliantly eye-opening, very well written, highly recommended. I borrow from her generously. Well, she lends to me generously. I borrow from her liberally in this discussion. So she talks about the sort of genesis of the discussion of human rights and market institutions, and takes us all the way back to post-World War II Europe, actually. So we're sitting in the heart of it. And there were, everybody was concerned about dignity and liberty at that time, the dignity and liberty of human beings, because we had been through so much as a world, as a global community, we had been so much. But then there were two ways of realizing this humanity and dignity and liberty and humanity. So the human rights advocates were talking about safeguarding social and economic rights, and they were focused on ensuring rights, even if those required state intervention for redistribution and interference with the competitive market practices. And I imagine on the other end, the order liberals and the neoliberals having a heart attack, saying that's totalitarianism. Any kind of state intervention is bad. And you can completely understand where they were coming from, because they had seen state-run enterprise state as an enterprise to be really, really problematic. And I'm not a history scholar, so I won't go into it, but I think I know enough about history to say that I understand where they were coming from. And they said, what we really need is a competitive society as a basis for civil society and individual rights. So they were not opposed to socioeconomic rights. They were simply saying, what is the structure that fulfills those rights? And so in their own way, they were actively promoting rights that supported market relations and formed the basis for enabling economic activity. So just a few rights that I picked up from Jessica White. So the right to liberty was really the right to do anything that does not harm the market. The right to equality was the right to equality before law, not equal standards of living, whatever. Right to security was the right of the competitive market to be protected from those unable to adjust to its demands. Right to property was the right to keep foreign investments safe and to move capital freely across borders. And really, when I read this, I understood a lot of the modern, or in our times, the kind of difficulty we've had with certain countries, where US has intervened in certain countries because they've said, these are our freedoms that they're. I've never used to understand that. I said, they're free people. Why are they interfering with your freedoms? But these are the freedoms they're talking about, and that is the interference with the freedoms. So this sort of led to a bit of a tension between, not a bit, but quite substantial tension between liberal constitutions and markets. So post-World War II, and especially the former British colonies, which were, I think, most countries, new countries that were created in that time were former British colonies, and they were adopting constitutions was the biggest commodity, I think, in that period, where countries were just adopting it wholesale. Everybody's in the market for a new constitution. And these constitutions were great hallmarks of sovereignty, national sovereignty, and political sovereignty, and rights for our people that they've not had under the colonial order. And a lot of them have this wonderful, I know 2 or 3 constitutions well, but I'm assuming that a lot of them look very similar if I pick them up. They have this chapter on fundamental rights. The chapters are, they have a lot of it echoes the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So, nice list. Focuses on individuals that will exercise these rights. And sometimes, individuals definitely, but some rights are specific to citizens, but not, the rights are not only for citizens, they're also for individuals. And certainly individuals and citizens have recourse to the national courts who are going to be the bastions of justice. And, the world looks pretty good when you read those very well-written constitutions. But there was another movement happening exactly at the same time, which is that this whole economic infrastructure of what we now understand as the global economy was also being developed in that period. And countries were becoming connected with each other through economic treaties and trade agreements. I mean, bilateral investment treaties, late 1950s, were pretty much dictating what kind of economic sectors that countries were going to foster, which ones were going to be left behind. Even this priority setting, something that Kati and I have been talking about, the priority setting was not taking place at a national level. It was really sort of a very global enterprise. And I don't know what the thinking was behind that, but it is interesting to consider it. But what was also really, really important at that time was GATT and WTO were really designed to protect free markets and competition and to oversee the integration of the global economy according to the morals that we've just mentioned. So again, when we talked about right to freedom or equality or security, we are actually talking about these very strong economic values that were embedded in the economic treaties that we were entering into. These treaties were not focused on citizens and individuals, they were focused on consumers. And so they had different way of slicing the world between consumers and producers. And the idea was consumer sovereignty, consumer protection, that was the highest value. And this creates a tension. So for instance, country A, my country, might be a country of small producers. Country B, your country, might be a country of small consumers. There's a tension. What is the structure going to favor? And that tension we'll see playing out in the right to food. The funny thing is, it's not always about countries, though. That's a very easy way to dissect it, and I apologize for having fallen into the trap of doing it the easy way. It happens in countries. So you have that stratification within a country. US is a huge example of that stratification existing within the US. And that important question that emerges from this is, are constitutions superior to the economy? Are they managing the economy? Or are they enabling the economy? Which is the higher value? I think different countries would answer differently, but those countries that subscribe to it, the free market economy, would say, it's just providing the enabling structure. Please get out of the way once you've done that and let the market run its course. So this is where competition comes in, because competition was a really, really important tool for preserving this economic order that was being created we see it in the 50s with the IMF, the World Bank. WTO, of course, came much later, but WTO was really building on the GATT, but I think the structures were already there in the 50s. And this is really the reason, I think it's the competition lawyers don't often talk about this, but this is really the underlying rationale for why competition law has been so successfully transplanted. I would say it's the most diffuse transplanted law of the modern world. It started with it started with 2 countries, or 1 in the 19th century, going to 2, and now 130 jurisdictions. And we've been talking about some of these jurisdictions never passed a competition order. Certainly these jurisdictions are not asking for this law. Most of them are not. So what is really going on? And you can then see, okay, it's an important tool in this global framework, and that's why we need it. It needs to be, it's a placeholder. It absolutely has to be there. So initially, it was more formal, formulaic. Increasingly, with the influence of the Chicago School in the US, it has become much more economics focused, I should say, and a particular brand of economics, which is the welfare economists, and they talk about consumer welfare. I have students confusing this idea of welfare every single day. And I have to say to them, please, welfare does not mean welfare in English. It means a very specific kind of it's an economic principle of welfare, which is really judged on prices that consumers pay. And that is when we talk about consumer welfare, what we are really saying is, what kind of prices are they paying? We will tell ourselves, and we believe as scholars, that prices are an indication of how resources are allocated in society. So if you have allocated proficiency, you'll have good prices, but we don't really see the impact of those prices. So a country's commitment to competition is usually provided in its constitution. So again, these liberal, I did a little bit of an analysis of the Indian and Pakistani constitutions, and I noticed that whilst one claims to be a very country embedded in religion, and the other country is secular and more socialist oriented, but both protect these rights. So you think, okay, so beyond the words, beyond the sort of semantics, beyond the rhetoric, there is a structure, and the constitutions have protected market economies. But the competition law itself is an ordinary law of the land, and it can be changed, it can be transplanted. So the value is committed to at the constitutional level, but then the actual modalities are provided in a law, which can be amended, of course, by Parliament. Okay, so now bringing all of this, now trying to bring these two stories together. There's an international right to food, which has to rely on markets to be realized. It has no choice. That's the way it is interpreted. That's the reality of it as well. And then you have the law, the competition law, which is coming from a very different value space, which is a very sort of economic value system that it's coming from. So really, ultimately, the tussle is between two sets of values, which I think is really, it's like a little battle being played out well, the battle is being played out in many spaces. We had a lecture on environmental law as well yesterday, which that's not also another battlefield, but we're today going to look at a small battlefield here, which I think impacts all of us just as much as the environment does. I mean, I've talked about this already, but I think just to say that yes, the consumer under EU competition law is the intermediate consumer as well as the end consumer, and you're also looking at the competitors in the downstream markets. And we focus on price, but EU says price is a shorthand for assessing output choice, quality and innovation and product. So they're saying we're not just focused on price, it's a bigger thing. But what has happened is, since the 1980s, I mentioned the competition law has proliferated around the world, and they've largely adopted the EU model because it's easy to adopt. It's small, short, well-written, easy to adopt. The US is much more complicated. So they borrow the US jurisprudence, but not the institutional structures. It's all very much EU. Then these countries also borrow heavily from the decisions of the EU and the US in interpreting their own competition principles, because competition has it hasn't emerged organically, so it doesn't have roots. You don't have your own jurisprudence to go to when you're understanding competition law. It's so economic based. You need you need to go back to the parent country, and go back and borrow again from them. And in borrowing those, not borrowing, adopting, utilizing those decisions, what we are doing quite sort of perhaps even subconsciously is also borrowing and adopting the idea of economic welfare and price being the most important indicator of that welfare. So this has proliferated along with the laws that the countries have borrowed. And the final point here is that what this means is that all domestic competition regimes are only likely to spring into action, as it were, when they see a price signal that they need to worry about. So that's become like that single-minded focus of all competition regimes all around the world. Not even effective focus, but nevertheless a focus. So how does this work out in food supply chain? So the food supply chain, when we see the model in a textbook, that's what it looks like. I borrowed this from somewhere. I've used it many times before in other work as well, but this is not I've not made it. But there are factory providers, they sell to agricultural producers, who sells to wholesalers, who sells to processors, etc. And we buy from retailers. We are the end consumers. This is something I've made myself. And this is what I think it really looks like. What you have in the middle is wholesalers, processors, and distributors coming together and really becoming one. They're very big, there are very few of them. So you really have a bottleneck. The factory providers and agricultural producers have only a very few large agribusiness to sell to. And then the agribusiness is, again, the retailers have very few agribusiness they can work with, and then the consumers are working with few retailers. I should have made the retailers a little bigger as well, but then it wasn't fitting on the screen. But there is this sort of a bottleneck in the middle, which has come about through a lot of mergers and vertical integration that has taken place in the middle, where companies have just, and it's all very noble because they're doing it for efficiency, they're doing it for economies of scale. So I'm trained as an economist before I was trained as a lawyer, so it really speaks to me. I'm like, yay, this sounds really good. Absolutely, let's go for it. So what we have then are power relations in the food value chains. And we are now increasingly, and I'm sure you know this, we're talking about food value chains. We're not talking about food supply chains only. We're talking about how value is distributed along these chains. And we're really seeing that these large agribusiness is actually dominating the sector on both ends. It's really like holding the fort here. And what kind of power they wield depends on the product. And we've been talking about meat this morning, but we can talk about soybean, we can talk about cocoa, we can talk about, you name it, and we can talk about tea, I think is another one, but there's just so many sectors that we can talk about. And the way they exercise their power, and I mentioned a few of them, we talked about another one this morning who I will not be talking about again, but they're really defining how things are done. And I think I have read several journalistic accounts of their operations. It's interesting to see that they're taking from the same book. It's exactly the same pattern. So the product might be different, but the pattern of operation is really the same. Largely, I think there's a very strong vertical integration of corporate power and then a horizontal integration of corporate power. Interesting to see that competition authorities have not sprung into action, and we'll see why. We will see why. Before we see why, we will talk a little bit about the impact of this kind of exercise of power. So the first impact that is the most immediate one that I think we all think about is the impact on small farmers and workers. I have to say before I talk about this that competition lawyers don't want to hear about this impact. Not because they don't think it occurs, not because they don't think it's real, but because they think it's not their problem, right? They say, well, too bad, not our problem. But we leave, because this is not a competition law lecture, really, we leave that for the side and just talk about, in human terms, what is the impact? So first of all, there's a great imbalance of power, surprise, surprise, huge imbalance. But there's an economic imbalance, which means that farmers don't have a choice. There's usually one buyer for the products they're producing, right? We're talking about small farmers, not large conglomerate farms. They're producing one product. If they need to sell it, there's just really one buyer. It might not be the big chain that we recognize, but even the wholesaler who's buying from them is actually representative of the big power. So there's really no choice at this level. Very often, these farmers are locked into contracts, which means that they have no say on what they're producing, which also has led to a decrease in farmers' ability to feed themselves. So they actually can't use their soil in that way. There's also a lot of information asymmetry. They actually have no ability to talk to other farmers to learn what is happening because they have no information. Who else is producing what kind of strategies they're using. So information is also used as a form of control over these farmers. And with modern AI processes, it's just, I think it's exponential growth information, the exponential growth in the information that the big companies have, farmers can have no access to it. And they only share what they need to share. So there are a lot of ways in which the power is aggregated in the agribusiness. But in addition to that, imagine that tremendous power, and then there's uncertainty due to fluctuation in consumer demand. Yeah, which makes the farmer really vulnerable, because tomorrow I can just stop buying. One of the things we said earlier today was that usually these contracts easy to cancel. I can just cancel because I don't need your work anymore. So I may have invested a lot in a farm, but I have no information, I have no projections, I have no idea of what I might need in a year or so, and I'm really at the mercy of these big businesses. And of course, the big companies have one incentive and one, I mean, okay, maybe I'm simplifying, but a primary incentive is to lower their costs. That would be a primary incentive. If a company is a profit-making mechanism, which it is, one of the things you do to maximize profit is lower your costs. And when you lower your costs, what do? This is a cost. I mean, this is the biggest cost you might have. You will do things to lower it. So that's the impact on farmers. And like I said, farmers are still perhaps property owners, but then they're farm workers as well who are looped into this. And I'm not going to the labor side of it, but we can explore it in questions. There's a huge impact on the environment. Again, something I think most of you were there yesterday, so you've heard a lot about the noxious air pollution. There's waste. There's crop diversity. I think that's probably, to me, one of the biggest damages. And I think, quite interestingly, a lot of these, the agribusiness is quite intelligent in where it locates its plants. So I think you heard yesterday in the talk that a lot of environmental assessment schemes have been scaled back. The legal protection has been scaled back. Brilliant. That's where I go and place a farm where in Pakistan, for instance, there'll be no environmental assessment, or it's easy to buy environmental assessment. I'll place a plant there. Who can catch me? And, it's somebody else dying or getting very sick. I've already mentioned that, using the soil in a particular way for a single crop also depletes nutrition in the soil. So we mentioned availability at the beginning, and what are we doing for availability of future generations? And this is all because of this corporate, desire to have economies of scale and low costs and big profits. So all of this is feeding into it. This one is really interesting, I think, because what competition law does think about is impact on consumers. But it says, consumers are not affected because they're getting food for low cost. And you can see happy. That's probably me buying a lot of junk food in a supermarket and feeling thoroughly happy about it. But what am I doing? I'm actually really giving up my health for this food. And I'm buying it because it's made much more easily available to me than nutritious food, at a much, much better price than nutritious food. And the focus on price actually makes this impact less obvious, because as long as the price is low, we don't really worry about what the real cost is in terms of nutrition. And that's where the right to food comes in. But there is this other consumer as well that's living in the country where the production might have been taking place, who's also getting affected in a very different way. Now there, the cost is going up because, and this is, bear with me when I try to talk about this, it's the waterbed effect. Does everybody know about the waterbed effect? Yeah, so you already know. But basically, that's raising the cost of the other products that they're not able to produce. They're giving such discounts to the large business that they have to raise it somewhere else. So, and this I've seen, and I'm sure those of you who, you may have seen it in your markets, that food goes up in price locally, but it's less expensive abroad. What's going on? It was produced here. Why is it more expensive for me? It happens not just with food, it happens with a lot of domestic items that are made for export. So it's a real phenomena, and that consumer is also affected. But because that consumer is not directly affected by the action of the agribusiness, it's more of a ripple effect. Nobody's bringing a competition case against the agribusiness. But to say that the consumer is not getting affected is, I think, overlooking the dimensions of how consumers can be affected. Somebody asked me this question earlier today, but hang on a minute, farmers have subsidies. So isn't that great? And the answer is no, it isn't great. Because, and I'm not going to go into, we talk about CAP a little bit. Other countries don't even have CAP. There's a problem with CAP. CAP may not be the best solution, but many countries don't even have the CAP. So whatever it's doing, they don't have it. But also what I saw in I've been reading about the US Department of Agriculture is that, in fact, the subsidy scheme, the subsidies were provided in the form of low-cost loans to the farmers, and that was actually very comfortably co-opted by banks and the big business for their own ends. And I mean, we can talk about it again in questions, but that was very, very interesting for me to watch how the big capital can speak to each other in ways that the farmer will have no access to. So maybe the farmer is still living and getting food, but they're losing their farms, they're losing their ways of the way of life. There's, as somebody mentioned, they're sleeping on the streets. It's a real detriment to their way of life, and that's not talked about because, oh, the subsidy box is ticked and the business box is ticked and they're still eating, so it's okay, but there is a real detriment going on. So subsidies are not always the answer, I think. Or at least happening in silos from other policy initiatives is not the answer. You might also say, but come on, they have legal recourse, right? Big deal, they can go to court. And I'm not going to read these slides, but I will tell you a little story about the potato farmers in, so PepsiCo produces Lay's chips. And I have an Indian colleague who's nodding at the back and saying, yes, I've heard about the Lay's chip story. But Lay's chips buys a certain, you have to have potatoes of a certain variety, no other kinds of potatoes. And you can imagine entire stocks being thrown out because they don't meet that criteria of Lay's chips. PepsiCo was large, they had the kind of access to justice that small farmers couldn't have. The only recourse they could have had was doing a sit-in outside the courts and the government houses, and they had to have an out-of-court settlement. I don't call that recourse to justice. That's tragic. And I mean, they were lucky to organize themselves as well as they did. And that's still India, where the farmers are very intelligent and very well informed. I don't know where else we would see that. We've heard a lot about farmer suicides. So I think the access to justice is a little bit theoretical. It's not real. I've already mentioned before, environmental harm, there's no real access there as well. Consumers, we're told consumers have rights and they have consumer courts. Consumers often don't know. They don't have enough information to ask for the right quality, because a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is shrouded in secrecy. A lot of the medication used on food or antibiotics injected into food, we just don't know about these processes. We had a very interesting discussion this morning from SOMO, and I think they're doing a lot of research now which will bring up this information. There are a lot of journalistic accounts, but they're in silos. There's a need to actually see them together and see what is happening. And again, consumers are interested in price quite often. That's it. I mean, if you're really suffering from poverty anyway, are these going to be your concerns? Probably not. They have to be somebody else's concerns. So the need for a competition solution, there definitely is a need for a competition solution, but is there a competition solution? Why? I mean, so just backtracking a little for a moment, why do I say there's a need for a competition solution? Because competition is so critical, decides how markets operate. And food, how we eat it, is so largely determined by how markets operate that you cannot leave competition out of this story. I think it's a big omission on the part of competition to just take itself out of the environmental story or of the food story and say, well, that's not our concern. Because I think if something is happening because of the way competition is running, then it is a competition concern. I'm an outlier to say this, but there are few of us, but we're still outliers. So I think we can all agree that a lot of what is happening in the food sector is just because this agribusiness is so powerful that they can dominate both ends of the market. And how do they come about this power? They come about by consolidation. Competition definitely, through its merger control rules, can interact with the consolidation of power process, but it doesn't. And maybe that's a question of where we are drawing the thresholds. So we have a test in competition law, significant impediment to effective competition. Are you going to become too dominant? Yeah, but maybe the dominance tests need to be re-examined. So I think that the mechanism exists, but it's just not being used until things go really out of control. Now we have this innovation theory that if you're going to affect innovation, then yes, you're being anti-competitive. So maybe there is room now. I think the big tech is going to be the big breakthrough for a lot of other things. But maybe there is room now to look at something beyond these issues as well. But for now, it seems that if they think that the merger is not going to affect consumers in a big way, and I've been able to demonstrate that consumers are only part of the puzzle, and only looking at how they're affected by price is only part of the puzzle, but that's where the focus is at present. If it's not going to be negative there, then really the rest of it might be sad. We feel bad as human beings, but it's really not our problem. I think that's really the approach that has been taken. So a lot of scholars have been pushing against it. My work contributes to it a little bit. My former supervisor has worked a lot on this as well. He talks about the reconceptualizing of the consumer welfare standard so that it includes socioeconomic considerations. This is because I'm quoting from him, so I will read this. Rather than focusing exclusively on a narrow version of efficiency based on a new classical price theory. I can tell you that EU competition authorities reject this idea. They say, sorry, competition law is not a solution to all problems in the world, because when we wrote this paper, we talked about holistic competition law, and they said, well, that might be a constitution then, so let's not talk about this. It's also been proposed that we should have a single authority that can actually have all these issues, that can take cognizance of all these issues, and that too, I think, is going to be quite problematic. I think what might be possible is a conversation between different authorities, a sort of more bureaucracy, of course, is always the answer, but maybe that is what is needed, is another layer of analysis. I think I can already hear big business screaming in my ear saying that what we need is deregulation and more openness, but we can see that a lot of openness is actually creating problems. I think that one of the solutions can come from the US going against bigness itself, that I think one of the reconceptualizations that we do need is the idea that being big in itself is a problem. It's not what the big does. It's like saying having a bully in the class is a problem. It's not if the bully actually beats up another child, that's when you have a problem. I think we have to kind of indicate a different point of intervention, an earlier point of intervention, rather than waiting. And this was, those of you who were there yesterday, I think I asked a question as well, which was sort of hinting in this direction as well, that do we need an earlier point of intervention in corporate power? It's at the consolidation stage, rather than letting it become excessive and then saying, oh, well, now it's beating people up, and then you can do very little. You can contain it, but it's already so powerful. It's like containing I don't even want to call gorillas bad, but imagining a big gorilla saying, I'm trying to break free of these shackles, it's hard. And there's so many externalities already. How much are you going to control? So maybe we need to rethink about our ideas about economies of scale and efficiency as being the core, the most important value. But like I said, the US FTC is now being run by Lina Khan, who is Neo Brandeis School. I don't think she can change the world, but I think she's introducing new ideas. I did hear her speak, and I thought it was very conservative compared to how she used to write as a scholar. So who knows how far we can go with this. I've already, I tell you, Lina Khan has also clarified that, so they've said ESG commitments or anything in that vein can never rescue an illegal deal. So I think consumer welfare is always going to be not always, I should be more specific. At the moment, consumer welfare remains the most important paradigm for competition authorities. And this is across the board. And this is as recent as 2022, December, they had a roundtable, all these authorities were sitting around a table talking to each other. You could hear, the smaller countries all saying, well, what about our people? What about our people? And the big countries saying, but yes, what about consumers? And what about, and it was really bizarre. It was like, they must have sounded like this in 1945 as well. And to think they all think it still works is kind of funny, right? But these are very entrenched positions. And I don't see, maybe there will be a balancing, but what shape will it take? I think that's anyone's guess. Final thoughts. So we started off with a question, who is paying for our food? And the fact is we're all paying for what we eat, and not even through the money we pay for it. We're all paying in very different ways. We're paying by compromising the quality of what we're eating. Some are paying by simply not being able to afford it. That's tragic. I think that is absolutely the worst thing that can happen. And then people are paying by an irreversible damage to the environment, which we're paying through our future generations. And that's a very big price to pay. A lot of what we hear from big agribusiness, and certainly when the farm laws were introduced in India, which were repealed, but I think they linger. Their impact, at least on my psychology, the impact is quite strong. they came in as the big guardians, the big champions of competition, and they said the state-led is anti-competitive, and we are going to create competition. And I think we need to investigate more fully what kind of competition they're creating and what kind of impact that competition will have. So just something being competitive is not necessarily being good, and I think those are different values. And also, if it is increasing economic dependence on a particular corporation, I think that is something that I'm personally quite worried about, and I think that should be of concern. So yeah, I think if competition needs to remain relevant in the world going forward, it has to open up to these considerations. How much and how far is, we'll watch it together. But at least I think I would want to be looking out for this very much in my work. So thank you.